Did you just throw your phone?
No, I did not throw the phone.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Beg Pardon. As always, I'm your host Anthony, joined by Carlos. Welcome to the show. So today, we're going to do a special Hall of History episode of Beg Pardon. Hall of History is going to be a new segment that we have in the show. We're going to have it periodically, kind of sprinkled out throughout each season that we have. And we're going to cover historical topics around the whole world, not just indicative of the United States. So for our overseas listeners, you won't get bored of just hearing about U.S. history constantly, but it'll be about world history in general, and we'll give you our insights on topics, so hopefully some people will feel a little bit more educated, and we can open up a little bit more of a discussion. So welcome to the show. How are you, Carlos?
I am good. I am excited about this because every time I think of history, I think of we were in, I believe it was eighth grade history class. Mm-hmm. And I've been stuck on history ever since because my 8th grade history teacher showed us that film, that like musical 1776, I think it's called.
With the bill, like the dancing, like Declaration of Independence.
No, I think that was a Schoolhouse Rock, wasn't that?
I don't know.
No, 17.
I regret now doing the motion since I was wrong. And what that was.
No, 1776 had the guy who played George Feeney in Boy Meets World. And they were basically talking about like how the Declaration was signed and all this, but they had this song, and the whole premise of the song was "For God's sakes, John, sit down." And I don't know why that stuck in my head, like that musical number stuck in my head. And ever since then, I was like, history's pretty cool. So that Indiana Jones solidified history for me.
Right. I took AP U.S. history in high school, and I mean I really liked history before that, but that kind of like really solidified. Like my desire to like learn more because it was just so in depth. And my teacher, she was like, "Well, this is what it's going to be like in college. So everyone's gonna do this, and you take your AP exam at like the end of the year." And my mom would see like my homework that I would bring home, and she was like, "I don't feel like this is what college work would be like. I feel like you're doing like, is she getting her master's right now? Or are you doing like her work?" I was like, "I don't know." So I mean, my mom disagreed with with the sheer amount, but nonetheless, it was like a super interesting class for me. But today, I think it's important, especially with everything that's going on, that we educate ourselves on past injustices so as to not repeat them. You see kind of in the United States right now, just like this weird, this weird desire to either whitewash or alter the narrative to history, to things that happened. And I think it's really important that we discuss things that were very unpleasant. Because one, they teach us valuable lessons to not make the same mistakes over again. And they also show, resilience of people too. I think that there are lessons to be learned, positive lessons to be learned by groups of people that experience hardships. And I don't feel like we do enough of that here. I think the United States has such like a rough history that it becomes like one of those things where you like, I kind of don't want to talk about it. I don't want to like discuss it too much. And for our international listeners, is it the same in your prospective countries? Do you guys kind of feel that? Because it's everywhere. It's worldwide. As civilization has advanced, people have advanced to be more humane, more diplomatic, just times have changed. So I'm kind of curious to see if in other countries that sentiment is kind of like simmering kind of on the top, where things that are very unattractive about your history, it's placated to be like something else, or kind of like watered down. So today we're going to be discussing what is known as the Trail of Tears. So Carlos, if you just want to take like a second for those that don't know what it is, or what it was in the United States, to kind of cover that.
Sure. So, in a nutshell, before we kind of like dive deep into it, it was essentially, having different tribes and groups of Native Americans driven out of basically their homes to go, I believe it was past west of the Mississippi. They were kind of pushed out of, and it was predominantly like in Florida, Georgia, like places like that, kind of pushed them out. And I believe there were 5 tribes that were involved. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. Like I said, we're going to dive deeper into it. But I think it's something that, at least for I remember going over in high school, in middle school, we only went over like maybe 3 pages of it. And then kind of fast forwarded to of like, but we were pioneers and we were going west. And it kind of glanced over the atrocity.
Right. They romanticize, like, do you remember in school, like they would romanticize like being like life on the open prairie and moving westward and the hopes of gold and the gold rush and
Yep.
They romanticize that whole period where it made you as a kid be like, I wish I would have been there, or I wish I would have experienced it.
Yeah.
And then you learn more about it and you're like, this is a little distasteful. I don't think that I would have wanted to been there.
Who would wish that?
Right, yeah. But they, like, again, it goes back to what we were saying before, where people kind of romanticize even the negative parts of history because they're unpleasant to talk about. So yeah, that was it in a nutshell. And kind of what stirred about that whole entire movement of just expansion is just I just think the desire of who were the American people back in the late 1700s and early to mid 1800s, and just continued expansion along this vast unsettled land where they're like, this is ours, it's ours for the taking. We have like I think there's this feeling of ownership to it, even though it was clearly inhabited by other people. So that sentiment that whenever the first group of people arrived here on Plymouth Rock and they get here and they experience interactions with Native Americans for the first time. I mean, again, romanticizing, we learned in elementary school, like, they had a feast together and they broke bread and they were best of friends. Like, and they weren't. They were not best of friends. And they ended up in the tribes that were living on this land. They contracted multiple diseases. They were killed off by the settlers. Like, it was just romanticized to make it more palatable for the masses to consume. Yeah. But what's being taught in the public school system is a topic for another beg pardon episode that we will cover later down the road. So you have this desire to just continue pushing westward because that's where the land was, right? So fast forward to 1828, 1829. You have a new dude who is attempting and then becomes president of the United States, in Mr. Andrew Jackson. For those of you who don't know who Andrew Jackson is, look at a $20 bill because his face is what's stamped on there for the American people to enjoy every time they go and buy 2 drinks from Starbucks. And whenever they are like $20, well, they're like $16. So whenever he gets elected, his whole campaign was about, Indian removal. Removing Native people from their lands and expanding out westward. He's a Southern man. And in the South, there was more of a stronghold from Native tribes that were living there because they had been there for centuries. The land was irrigated. They had large farms. They had large plantations. They had everything had been there for centuries and centuries and centuries. So then whenever you have the southern settlers down there, they're like, we want more land, we want more land, we want more land. In the early 1830s, there was also gold found in northwest Georgia, which at the time was Cherokee Nation territory. So then you couple that with me not liking you, me thinking what you have I should have and I own, and there's gold in them hills. You mix all of those together, and then that was like the recipe for people to be like, yeah, let's get these people out of here.
Yeah, and it wasn't like, the most civil of let's get them out in the sense of here's a fair price, do you mind like we're going to buy this land for like a real estate transaction. It was like burning livestock and slaughtering people and squatting on the land. There wasn't any friendly like here's the deed type of thing. And I feel like that's kind of how people make it sound. Sometimes you talk about history is like, well, they were, what's the word I'm looking for? They were compensated. No, they weren't. They really weren't compensated. And if any monetary gain happened, it was not even close to being a fair compensation. It was a fraction of what they probably should have been getting. But also, Jackson kind of had more of a raw way of approaching it, whereas opposed to like a Washington who kind of just wanted to introduce them into the society, but in his own terms type of thing. Like, let's get them to where we are in terms of like religion and all these things, and kind of had them assimilate into our society, no harm, no foul type of thing. Whereas Jackson wanted to just get out.
Right. So Andrew Jackson becomes president of the United States. Boom. In 1830, they passed the Indian Removal Act. And in the Indian Removal Act, it implemented in the United States, that gave the president the ability to negotiate the removal of Native Indians and move them west of the Mississippi. But it explicitly stated it could not be completed by force. It was supposed to be like a negotiation. And as you mentioned, there was not much negotiation happening. It was like utter force. So then, as you mentioned in the beginning of the episode, there were 5 civilized tribes. There were more than 5 tribes there, but there were 5 civilized tribes that then Americans viewed as more human. I don't know another word to say, but more human and more acceptable. And that was the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, Cherokee, and Creek tribes. And they did their best to assimilate to the American way of life. And you can look at that however you kind of want to. They adopted the English language as well as their own native languages. They, created centralized governments. They ended up creating like owned pieces of land. And even some of them in the South owned African slaves that worked on their plantations to assimilate themselves into like the American way of life. But just as history just constantly keeps repeating itself, they still weren't one of them. And that was the view of the people. And I'm speaking like Georgia specifically around this time in the 1830s. They viewed Native Indians on those lands as subhuman or inhumane or savages, no matter what they did. I mean, the Cherokee, for example, had the first bilingual newspaper. It was in English and in Cherokee. They had elected officials. They lived in cabins and homes, like actual buildings. Mm-hmm. So, like, no matter what they did, it was kind of never going to be enough. So then the United States government's like, okay, Georgia, we want you to push this issue. We want you to push it and push it hard. So they're like, all right. So Georgia started making it impossible to almost coexist with them if you were Cherokee. So all of a sudden, the Constitution that they had, well, we don't think it's valid. Your elected officials, we don't think they're valid. If you were Cherokee, you could not testify in court. If you were Cherokee, you could not be a witness in court in American trials. And if you were not a Cherokee, if you were not a part of the Cherokee Nation and you were living or residing on Cherokee land, you had to have the express permission of the government, the U.S. government, and not the Cherokee, which was absolutely ridiculous. So you have missionaries, and you have people that help work as translators and educators to teach English and to work at the newspapers, and they were like, no, we only need the express permission of the Cherokee to be on their land. And then that's what pushed the Cherokee to be like, okay, what are we going to do? Because by now, we're nearing the mid-1830s, and you've already seen the Choctaw, you've already seen other Native American groups being forced off their land.
Yeah.
And they're like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Are we going to fight? Are we going to fight and take up arms? Had this been a couple generations before, I think that's probably what they would have done. Hey, I think we should fight them. I think we should fight to keep what we're going to do. And instead, the new generation's like, let's take them to court.
Mm-hmm. And I think, well, the thing, too, is that, like you were saying, a lot of people kind of romanticize it and everything, and we kind of looked at it as, well, that must have been the popular opinion at that time. Everyone must have been on the same train, and they really weren't. Not everyone was on the same train of, let's drive them out, let's drive them out. Andrew Jackson even, and I'm sure you're going to touch on it in a little bit, even kind of went against the Supreme Court himself, because the Supreme Court kind of stepped in and said, like, this isn't right. It's what did they say? I'm looking at it here. It says these practices and affirmed that Native nations were sovereign nations. So basically, they were telling them, like, just let them lie, kind of thing, leave them alone. And Andrew Jackson kind of blew past that and said if they couldn't come to an agreement, it was a stillborn agreement. So basically, it was just a standstill, and he was going to do what he wanted to do. So it's not like, we were always taught that all of America was kind of, we got to get this land, we got to do this. There were a lot of people who saw them as just leave them, let them be. Like, they're people too. They have their own, way of living, and like you said, they had their own newspapers. They had a high literacy rate, so they were educated people. They weren't, as everyone likes to paint, savages, and that wasn't the case. Like, they were people. They were people. Like, I think that's what people have to remember, so that you can kind of wrap your mind around how vicious this was. That these happened to people. This didn't happen to, some made up creatures or fairy tales that we created. These were living, breathing people with families that this happened to.
Yeah. And you had, similar to what you just mentioned, so you had John Marshall at the Supreme Court being like, okay, hey, they're sovereign nations. Georgia, you can't not recognize that. We, as a nation, as the United States, we had already established that they were a sovereign nation before. So it is what it is. And then Andrew Jackson famously said he made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Basically, underscoring what you said, I'm not going to enforce it. Let the judge do it himself. But Andrew Jackson at the time was, the supreme ruler of the land. He was the president of the United States. And at his direction, the harassment continued. The violence continued. So then in 1835, you had three Cherokee like self-appointed leaders of the Cherokee Nation. They were not the actual leaders of the Cherokee Nation. I cannot stress that enough for the point that I'm going to make. But they were three concerned citizens who were like, hey, I feel like the only way we're going to get out of this alive is if we make a deal with the U.S. government. A treaty with the U.S. government. So in 1835, they established this treaty with the U.S. government that was like, hey, we'll leave. We'll go if you give us relocation assistance, which I don't know what that would have been. It's not like they were packing U-Hauls. Like, I honestly don't know what that would have been in contextual terms. $5 million and damages. And they zipped it on over there. And then whenever the Cherokee found out, the 90% that did not want to relocate, they were like, no, they are not representative of the Cherokee people. They aren't our officials that you've already recognized as we're a sovereign state, we have leaders. Those are not their leaders. Those are not their signatures. So they formulated a petition and sent it, and the U.S. ignored it. And they signed the treaty anyways. That would literally be like, let me get on my laptop real quick and zip something over to Vladimir Putin and set up a treaty between the United States and Russia It wouldn't happen. It absolutely would not happen. But that did. So then they're like, no, we're going to accept it. So those three Cherokee individuals, they were killed by the Cherokee. They were traitors of the Cherokee. And a sad irony, whenever they were formulating what became more of like an American themed like government with leaders and a constitution, one of like kind of the pillars of that was not doing things against the will and desires of the Cherokee people. And two of the ratifiers of that constitution were two of the three people that did the treaty behind their backs. So I don't know if it was a mix of desperation or I'm sure that's what it was. I'm sure they genuinely felt like there is no way we're going to survive unless we make this treaty. And that was in 1835. So then you fast forward to 1838. And only 2,000 people, roughly, had started the migration. Andrew Jackson's like, this clearly isn't fast enough. So he sends 7,000 troops down to what is now northwest Georgia. And he's like, round them up. And he starts rounding people up, shackling them outside their homes, bayonets pointed at their face. They go in there, ransack their homes, steal the stuff that they want, and then they start taking them to prison camps. This sounds reminiscent of the same thing we did in the 40s with Asian Americans or Japanese Americans. Like, again, just history like constantly repeating itself. So they put the people in internment camps, and then they're like, we'll start using the waterways and estuaries to get them to the western unsettled land of what is now Oklahoma. At the time, it was unsettled. So we're going to send them over there. Well, the water dried up. Not all the water, but it became too low. So then they're like, make them walk. And then that's what became known as the Trail of Tears. It was over 15,000 in its entirety. I mean, there were different entrance points, different exit points to the trail, but in its entirety, it was like 15,000 miles long.
Yep. And it started, it looks like actually, in my notes here, it looks like it started actually in 1831 with the Choctaw. And again, full disclosure, please forgive Anthony and I if we're butchering how you say some of these tribes.
Yes. I misspoke 5,000 miles. I said 15. It was 5,043 miles.
Yes. But it looks like, as Anthony was saying, they had to march through, but there wasn't any aid. There was no food. There was no supplies. There was no government help whatsoever. So you're marching toward this land that's not settled with no supplies, with no food. I highly doubt that the government allowed them to have anything so they can hunt for food. So you're kind of just marching along this trail, and it was actually one Choctaw leader who told an Alabama newspaper that it was a trail of tears and death. So Trail of Tears sounds bad enough, but you see the and death part, you realize there's probably people who are just falling off by the hundreds of this trail who did not make it along. So it's not like the whole community made it together all in one piece. They were probably losing people every single day while this march happened. And again, it continued, as you were saying, all the way to almost the 1840s, because it kept going through the 1830s. So it wasn't also like a 3-month trip where everyone said, all right, in 3 months this is all done. It was continuous, and it affected all the tribes down there. And I think that it's just something that you were touching on, and I think it's great that you expanded on how massive this was. Because again, when you see it in textbooks, it sounds like it's maybe 1 or 2 tribes, and It sounds like it wasn't that far of a journey. This is a long way. If you don't know how far Oklahoma is from Georgia, it's a good distance. Even driving, it's a good distance.
I'm about to say, park your car on the northwest side and take a walk. For real.
Yeah.
It's super far. So in all, it's estimated that over 100,000 people were pushed into forced migration. And 25% of those people died. Estimated. No one's ever going to know the real numbers, the real amount of loss. And what made it even worse is, again, the death continued after that because in the southeastern part of the United States, many of those tribes had been there for centuries, right? So you're going into Oklahoma now, what is now Oklahoma. It is unsettled. You have to settle that land. You have to find what you can to grow crops, to cultivate crops, to have like a brand new way of life. So I'm fairly certain that death continued a year and a half after that. And it was the most susceptible people who died. So imagine taking an entire group of people and force migrating them across this United States, and all of the old people die. So all of the people that know who can teach you who you are and where you came from. So all of your past is dead. And the infants, those were the two populations that died the most. So all of your infants are dead. So your past is gone and your future is gone. And you're just there. And you're forced to make a new way of life in Oklahoma. And then the United States is like, you know what? We won't bother you. We'll put you over there and it's going to be fine. We won't ever come back. And then what? By 1907, Oklahoma was a state. And then that was it. It was done.
And it just shows that it wasn't just Jackson. I mean, Martin Van Buren played his part in it. It wasn't just one president. It was kind of like they all carried this like Olympic torch of I'm going to pick up where you left off, which really isn't a good pick up where you left off. It's not a good rally I would have been a part of. Like, right. I wouldn't have been like, oh yeah, hand me the baton so I can keep going with this. So the fact that it was more than one president is kind of alarming to me, in the sense that how, messed up were policies or decisions back then that more than one president thought, we should probably keep doing this. It's going smoothly. Like, who thought that this was a good idea and this was going smooth? And like you said, 1900s come along and you were told, okay, we're going to back off. Just kidding. Now it's a state.
Right.
So, I mean, where can anyone hold anyone at their word at this point? And I think, we're going to start to see more of that as time progresses, of just deal after deal after deal being broken with not just these 5 tribes, but a lot of tribes America has broken deals with over and over. At this point, I don't even know why they're holding conversations anymore. But, like you said, it's going to keep happening.
Yeah. And there's like a fraction of tribal just communities left in what is now the United States. And, to speak on the resilience of people, and I focused a lot on the Cherokee, but again, as you mentioned, there were so many other tribes and so many other groups of people that were forced off their land and forced to migrate out west. So I want to underscore that. I want to make sure that everyone understands that. But to explain just the amount of resilience, now in northeastern Oklahoma, you have the Cherokee as like one of the largest employers, with like over a $2 billion purchasing power in the United States. I mean, the resilience of those people is absolutely incredible. To say, we employ 11,000 people in private and public businesses, and we have this much purchasing equity in the United States. Like, you tried to write us off, but we're still here. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's something to be proud of. There's also an acknowledged Cherokee Nation in North Carolina as well. During the forced migration, there were many that escaped and hid in the mountains in North Carolina. And there's an outdoor drama production, Unto These Hills, is what it's called, and it's about the forced migration that they experienced. And it's done by the Cherokee. It's one of the oldest outdoor dramas like to date. And you can still buy. I mean, probably not right now because of COVID, but you can still get more information about it. You can still, whether it's calling or online, and the link to that will be right below this video for you guys to see too. But it just goes to show the sheer resilience of people, given the absolute worst odds that you could possibly get.
Yep.
So it's very hard as Americans and I'm an American, so I'm speaking as one, it is very hard to reconcile a past where some of the largest atrocities are pushing people that had already occupied a land for centuries, pushing them off their land and replacing them with people that we took from another place against their will. Like it's literally sometimes the most difficult thing to reconcile as an American is the role that the mentality of this country, the shared, like you said, it wasn't just one person, the shared mentality of at all costs.
Yep.
At all costs, regardless of human rights, regardless of dignity, regardless of respect, regardless of compassion, regardless of love, regardless of anything, we will get what we want.
Yep. And
that's hard to reconcile.
You touched on the resilience of everyone, and it's also, I mean, you have to remember too, in the 40s and the 50s and even in the 60s, you had all these westerns that still depicted them as the savages, that, you know, the Lone Ranger and Roy Rogers and, you know, all these people were going to go save our land from them, and it's not ours. That's the kicker in all of it. You are rooting for a hero who's really a villain in that story, because he's not claiming land that was his, he's stealing land and murdering the people, and you're cheering him on because that's what, you know, pop culture told you to do, was because it's an us against them mentality. So not only did you go through the actual atrocity, now you have to have it shoved in your face as a pop cultural narrative for decades, and you still find a way to preserve what culture you can and start to create businesses for yourself and, you know, have the reservations that you have, and still try to keep those ties to your culture so close. And I think it's phenomenal that they've been able to do that to some degree. There are, I know, some languages that Native Americans have that are dying, if they're not dead already. And they're pushing them in their schools on their reservations to learn their languages again. But, you know, even today, we are still going through sacred burial grounds to build things. We are still, you know, it was last year, 2 years ago, in the news about the pipelines, still going through their land for pipelines. You know, we're still doing these things to them. Maybe not forcing them out like we did once upon a time, but you're still doing them. So I think, you know, our 3 pages on the Trail of Tears might need to be dove a little bit deeper into, so we don't keep repeating this to the same group of people who have been extremely resilient up to this point. And I just think, you know, we have to kind of look and realize that American history gets romanticized and glossed over a lot. But if we kind of can sit down and look in the mirror and realize a lot of bad things happen, but it doesn't have to keep happening. We don't have to keep painting people as what they were painted as before. I think you're going to start to see a better, more cohesive type of thing that we all want to strive for. Is that, you know, you always see the plays where when you're in elementary school and they do like, this land is your land, this land is my land. It was their land.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, it's not really like we're sharing this. It was their land and you took it. And with no mercy, with no grace, no anything. And then you made them into a villain. So I don't think that's the best song to sing.
And once you control the narrative, control the narrative as we do in the United States, you can control the miseducation of an entire generation, multiple generations, ours included. Like we've just talked about, dedicating 3 pages in a history book to like the savages that had to be moved out of here. It's just not acceptable, and it's one of the reasons why the same negative things just keep happening in this country, just continuously. I mean, compared to most, we are a relatively young country, but it's the same. It is the same atrocities over and over and over and over again. And until we recognize that as a collective and we re-educate ourselves for the people that have already been miseducated and properly educate future generations, it's just going to continue. But I do see strides. You know, I'm just not patient. So I'd like to see more. But we do see strides. So hopefully you guys were able to take something from this episode. You know, we'd love to hear your comments, your feedback on the episode. There's going to be more Hall of History episodes that we're going to cover. And some really great ones too. Not everything is going to be doom and gloom. We will cover very optimistic stories and stories of ingenuity and stories of passion, stories of courage. We're going to cover those as well. So we appreciate you guys for tuning in with us today. Make sure that you give us a like. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, almost any social media. All the links for those will be below this video for you guys to see. And thanks for tuning in today.
And as always, remember, please, there is also the audio version where you can listen to on all your favorite podcast platforms, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio. I always forget one, so just wherever you
Google
listen to
Podcasts.
Yeah, look for us wherever you listen to it. But that will do it for us on this year's first Hall of History episode, brought to you by the Beg Pardon Boys. As always, he's been Anthony, I've been Carlos, and remember, tune in for more history so we don't compete, or I should say, don't repeat the past. Until next time.